it's, I mean, I saw one analysis that actually the reduction in deaths due to reduced pollution, especially in China, will actually be more than the number of people who die from it, possibly.
Wow. The problem is the solution.
Yeah. But yeah, it'll put a reverse on globalization in terms of interdependency of everything across the world. But it could be the big unraveling of global financial systems because of the weakness. It's hard to know. Yeah. Yeah, well, this is all going together.
Yeah.
So yeah, this deflationary unraveling that we never expected 20 years ago. We sort of thought of it as a hyperinflationary, you know, where prices would be very, very high. But of course, it's nearly 15 years ago now that Nicole Foss's work convinced me that we're facing more deflationary economic collapse, where prices actually go down because consumption keeps going down, and the only way to keep consumption happening is by more and more debt, and that eventually is unsustainable. So prices of fossil fuels going down are largely a reflection of excess failure of consumption to rise, that people are actually using less, and that the investment in new development has been supercharged by incredibly low interest rates. So the ability to borrow money, at least for corporations, at virtually free money has meant they've invested massively in all of these developments, and most dramatically in the United States with shale oil, in ways that will never pay back those debts unless oil was over $100 a barrel. So that means there's actually been a lot of oil in the world market because of developments that no sensible business model would have ever allowed to happen. Like, we never thought the banks would loan billions and billions of dollars to oil companies that could never pay it back. And that's what's actually happened.
And I might be sidetracking you, but you think that is because they're scared of sort of breaking the narrative that we have today? Like, is that what it is?
Yeah, but partly it's the creation of $24 trillion following the GFC of completely non-existent money to stimulate the world economy by the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Japanese Central Bank, not counting what China did in supercharging its own economy with massive money creation. So that money flowed largely to the corporations. It didn't flow to people. Whereas in Australia, because Australia was maybe richer and maybe its government was more sensible at the time, it gave $1,000 to every household, which did stimulate the economy, but it did it with ordinary people spending money. Whereas the money that was largely created in the world went straight into the big corporates via the big banks. They basically bailed out the banks with all this extra money. So that meant large developments, you know, could get very, very cheap money. And of course, the assumption was that an oil price of $80 a barrel or more would easily allow those companies to pay back. And, you know, it's also allowed the incredibly fast rollout of renewable too, in spite of dysfunctional policies, like in this country, very, very dysfunctional government policies, and yet there's been this huge investment in renewable because money is very, very cheap, never been this cheap in history.
Mm.
You know, so that debt-driven process means you get surplus capacity of all sorts of things, including oil, if at the same time ordinary people's ability to earn money and keep their own debt at bay, especially in previously rich countries, you know, like the United States, has gone down. So that means consumption, like in Italy, consumption of oil is half what it was in the 1980s. And only a small part of that is renewable development. Most of it is just people are poorer.
Yeah,
and the United States average vehicle miles traveled, you know, went down for many, many years. So, I mean, some of it is renewable transition, reducing dependence on oil, but that's only a very small part of it. It's mostly that more people are poorer or have more debt load and are trying to work out how to save money. So, and yet they're constantly trying to stimulate, you know, consumption to go up.
Yeah. Anyway, I've got a few things that I would like to cover,
yes.
but this is all very interesting. And
yeah, but not what we were talking about.
Well, no, it is. This doesn't matter. I have a few comments on that. Well, one is the left-wing government that was in Brazil for about 13 years.
Yeah.
Did get the economy going, largely with the same strategy that you just mentioned here, which is trying to redistribute income and social programs and things like that. But they didn't deal with land reform.
Yeah.
Sorry. They didn't deal with the banks.
Yeah.
So they didn't make any major changes. So what happened was they were basically overthrown. Whether or not there was a legit overthrowing doesn't matter. They were overthrown. But the poor people were left in debt as well, because they opened up credit lines for retirees, poor people, in order to sort of, you know, get the economy going. We now have a new government. The agribusiness was bailed consecutively for a few years in millions of, if not billions of dollars. So their debt is forgiven, but poor people's debt is not.
Yeah.
And so we've got this new one now, which is basically a large strategy to use all of the resources that are still available and funnel them to corporations again. Which brings us, David, I'm not sure how to what I was, one of my questions that I would like to talk to you is, you wrote Future Scenarios, and then a few years later, you wrote Crash on Demand, which is sort of approaches some of the things that we're talking about now. And then recently, an indigenous leadership in Brazil, his name is Ailton Krenak. He wrote a book which is called 10 Ways, something like that. The translation is 10 Ways to Slow Down the End of the World. It's not to stop, it's to slow down.
Yeah.
And then after that, he wrote he wrote an article, or was an interview or something like that. And he said something that goes a little bit at odds with what you say. He said that the individual pursuit for a sustainable lifestyle is a selfish one. And his argument was that meanwhile we have people in poor countries like Brazil trying to do their best. If they all could coordinate their actions, would not amount to 20 or 30% of the impact. Meanwhile, we have Nestle and Coca-Cola and all these companies literally drying out the country, and we're not going to have systemic change if people do not act on both ends. I think he was provoking something that you've been saying for quite a few decades as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's been some similar debates in here with the rise of more radical climate activism, especially Extinction Rebellion, especially stimulated or inspired over, the apparent effect of radical action in the streets to close down London, that was followed by the British Parliament declaring a climate emergency for whatever the value of that declaration is. But, that this hope that strong, in that case, direct resistance in the centres of power would have an effect. Now, of course, that's one aspect of working at the top. The other aspect is trying to sort of reform those systems. Now, a lot of people, there's a debate that way too, against reform versus rebellion and resistance, but focused in the larger structures. And then at the bottom, I think, thinking of the individual, the household, at the level that people have some power or an autonomy to do something, you can see both a sort of a communitarian version and an individual version, depending on people's partly political philosophy, but a lot of it depends on people's own personal psychology. What I notice is that a lot of people who advocate very strongly collectivist, organised approaches, and even very moderate ones like transition towns movement, which also emerged out of Britain in response to peak oil, Rob Hopkins' work, and the way that then spread around the world. I would see a lot of people, at least in our own context here, energized by doing things in a group, doing things collectively, and that always advocating the importance of that, which is, very true and strong, but often not understanding that some other people don't feel energized when they get in a group. They feel exhausted or, just personally, psychologically, and they work well one-to-one with other people, or, so that they have an internal psychological disposition to see solutions or work responses to the realities they find themselves in at the household level or in sort of more intimate relationships at a smaller scale. So it's not necessarily just, political or ideological views about, individualism versus, collectivism, and of course you could say that is fed by decades or centuries of the ideology of individualism, and then fossil fuel powered capacity to provide everyone with their own existence in a techno bubble separated from everyone else, that, that those forces have sort of led to a state where people, some people feel confused or frustrated or exhausted by efforts at, collective action. So, I think there's a lot of layers in these things, but you can also see that when I was giving the crash on demand message, I mean, it was primarily focused on the places where, in the richest countries, where middle class consumption represents such a huge part of the economy, as opposed to countries where there's a resource extracting economy for feeding the rich and the middle class in other countries. Yeah. Now, if you look at that gradation, Brazil is more towards that resource extraction end, even though it clearly has a very large middle class population, possibly more middle class people than Australia, you know, given the population size. And Australia is a little bit more towards the other end, but we also are in that position of being a massive net exporter of resources that keeps the world economy going. You know, we're the largest exporter of coal in the world. We're the largest exporter now of liquefied natural gas. And of course, like Brazil, we're a major agricultural exporter. So we do have a bit both sides of that equation compared with countries like Germany, Japan, the United States, Britain, which are largely receiving those resources.
And to that, I would add another thing, which is this large extraction is funded by the global economy, and it causes it causes huge degradation in both countries. Here we have Adani giving free water for 60 years, whereas in Brazil we are having the agribusiness being bailed out in billions every year in order to produce grains that won't feed the population and will like pretty much dry the aquifers and, you know, extinguish biodiversity and all that sort of stuff. And in that sense, with this context that you gave about the crash on demand as a message to a specific, not a specific, but a specific social and cultural, like richer countries. How do you see these strategies in places like Brazil, where, you know, the concentration of power and resources, they get like more and more cheap all the time, and then this sort of rationale in which we say, well, we need to start from the household, but we have people in a daily struggle in the households. Like, it's a different sort of scenario, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's a few arguments about the household level. Only one of those was the idea, which was that it might crash demand in the global system through the vulnerabilities of the financialization, the huge debt load, and actually crash that system that was destroying the planet. That was really a direct appeal to climate activists who were, you know, becoming increasingly disillusioned with their attempts at reform politics. And, you know, I was really appealing to them to say, hey, come over and join us in the sort of permaculture and kindred movements, because, you know, we're having more fun over here. So, you know, because I was looking at people who'd sort of spent 10, 15 years, incredibly capable people, the sort of people who could get rich, you know, very easily in Australia if they were motivated that way, who'd like devoted their incredible creativity and energy to trying to bring about these positive changes, and were basically becoming completely burnt out.
And bitter.
So I could see one of the possibilities is that a minority, well, firstly, that the majority of those people would move into some sort of catatonic disconnection, you know, not doing anything. And maybe a small proportion might resort to the strategy of the American academic who became known as the Unabomber, that we've got to bomb the, you know, the infrastructure of destruction. And I saw that as just inviting the fascist state, you know, down in a clamping down on, ecological terrorism, and that would be quite dysfunctional. So part of it was like, okay, you people who've done all these battles at the front line, whether it's achieved anything, we don't really know, but those people are spent and they need something which is more nurturing. So that was like my primary appeal really in that. But I was also saying, look, there may be some agency in moving towards some sort of enlightened self-interest to look after oneself in ways that also minimize one's impact. Because firstly, at that first level, it is a lifeboat. It's actually looking after your own self-interest, because I see a lot of people who work at this community level or higher levels are themselves incredibly dependent on all of those current systems keeping going. They haven't necessarily done much to build their own support base. So if the largest systems fail, they will go down with it. So we've got people with great ethics, great knowledge, who will actually fail because of that. So if you do that focus on looking after yourself first, if that is done in a way which is your own small experiment in saying, can our ideas work at the individual level? Do we have the capacity, in spite of all the larger system, to provide an example at that small scale, whatever the scale is, household or small community scale, of something that embodies what we are talking about, rather than just talking about what needs to change there. So if we actually are living that change, we come from a position of enormous ethical strength, because we are practicing what we preach. We are being our own guinea pigs. We are taking our own risks. That if we live with compost toilets and doing all these things, we are sort of modeling the changes that we see have to be supported in a larger sense. Now, if that example is a good example, it can provide a basis for other people to copy it who don't have as much drive to create something out of nothing, but can see, that works for them, I can copy that. So the possibility of viral replication when the conditions become suitable. If you don't have those models, then it doesn't matter how much change you bring at the top. Those structures at the top cannot create those models. They can't create them, in my view. So,
often those guiding the policies from above, they've got no idea how to actually actualize them at the bottom level.
Yeah. And that I've never seen in history any examples of policies that do anything more than say, we want less of that and we want more of that. Unless that exists as a living entity already, policy cannot actually create it out of thin air. So that, I think is, that's part of the weakness of that top structure. So that you could say, okay, well, you need both. But just following on from, so there's the lifeboat value, the model replication value, and then there's this third possibility where enough people are doing it, that not a majority, but this sort of 10% of the capable sort of empowered middle class, doing that, and ideally in partnership with people who are part of, you know, the underclass. And that sometimes, I think, involves partnerships that may exist within the current economic paradigm, you know, of sort of people who, and there's probably better examples of this in Brazil than there are in Australia, of people who employ other people in their household and they're effectively part of the household. They look after their children, you know, building relationships, even though they're asymmetric and not equal, between those who have the resources and the capacity and those who can help make that happen in a stronger system, who need the work, who, whatever form that is, that in creating those models, that withdraws money out of the centralized consumption, production, investment cycle. So if people are withdrawing, let's say 50% of their capital, their labour, which is generally highly skilled, qualified labour for middle class people in the modern world, and their consumption out of those corporate controlled systems. And if there was 10% doing that, then that would represent a 5% contraction in GDP of those centralized systems. Those systems would notice that. It's very critical. Like if the supermarkets had a 5% reduction in their turnover, that is like crisis for them, because it's not like majority politics that you need a majority of people to do it. And that's really important to understand those vulnerabilities. Now, what the response then is of elites to that is, firstly, they can identify this and say, this is what people are doing is economic terrorism. You have to consume, you have to work, and you have to invest. Now, I think that's a big call, of course, to get the population to agree that people who are doing things for themselves are somehow economic terrorists. Whereas when you try and stop Adani or stop, you know, the central business district, it's easy for elites to say, here's all these people stopping you doing, you know, just going about your daily life, etc. Whereas when you say, no, I'm just withdrawing, it's very hard to argue that people are not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
But anyway, one strategy is to say, we must crush this. So then they have to go around and try and pick on leading examples, make an example of them, or make laws. And you're trying to stop something which is very diffuse and spread out. It's very, very difficult for elite power to crush that, compared with actions that are centralized and, you know, like mass work. The other possibility, and I expect, and we can already see examples of where authority is effectively doing that, not necessarily in a strategic way, but planning regulations in this country and lots of different things, regulations on small agricultural enterprises, which make it more and more difficult to do things at the small scale. Maybe a bit less of a problem in Brazil, but very strong here. So that's one response. The other response they could give is go, okay, what do you people want? They could recognize us as a political constituency that actually has leverage because we have withdrawn our contribution. What do you want, you know, in the system? And then there would be the basis for some sort of political discourse about policy. Whereas at the moment, there's people shouting loudly to try and stop something or making symbolic resistance, but actually people have no power at all over those systems, so they are just ignored.
And you have said this elsewhere as well, which is you know, if you come from a position where you actually don't need them, you're in a better position to negotiate it than
Now I'm not confident that those things emerge, but at least that gives some sort of basis of both individual, collective survival and the possibility of some sort of influence. And then the last one was that if the whole system is just determined to push humanity over the cliff into especially climate chaos, then just that fragility of small declines in consumption, given how fragile the world economy is, you know, might have been enough to tip it over the edge. Now, I wrote that, you know, more than a decade ago now, and I must say I've been stunned by how the fake money financial economy has managed to continue. And you could say that in this context, you know, a global pandemic might be our last hope. You know, for you know, saving us from those large-scale systems, you know, driving us into, you know, a very severe state. But if that's the case, then, you know, I think it does remain important that people look after themselves, while at the same time there is the importance of solidarity. You know, so finding how to do those things together rather than them being separate, you know, imperatives pulling us in opposite directions. Because in the left, politically, there is a long and deep suspicion that if you are doing something which is good for you, it is inherently suspect. You know, it can't be, it must be at the expense of someone else.
Oversimplified sort of perspective of the situation, but yes, it's almost like if you're thriving at the expense of your peers.
Yeah, and look, that is understandable when we, you know, the thing of what if everyone did this? What is the fair level of what can be done? And those are really important metrics to sort of measure and calibrate what we do. But the very idea that anything that you do for yourself must be to the detriment of others is actually, from an ecological point of view, I think it's wrong. And the other notion that if you are suffering, you know, working for the great cause, the greater good, then, you know, that suffering is, or deprivation is actually the essential metric for the value of contribution.
Or how honorable a person is.
Yeah. And, you know, and obviously there's a great lineage there that includes, you know, the great history of martyrs who sacrificed themselves, you know, for the cause and became inspiration for whole movements that changed society. But it's also, you know, can be a recipe for, you know, well, not just failure, but inability to attract people to the cause. One of the other aspects that's played out here that I've noticed with taking my retro suburbia talks around the country with my Aussie Street presentation. I don't know whether you've seen, that's now online.
We've met, David, about 6 years ago, and we have a whole weekend of, I think it was 3 or 4 days in Mullumbimby.
Yeah. Well, the Aussie Street presentation is, of course, a story, and it's been probably the most powerful thing I've done, and it's an empowering story about Australian suburbia, through the past decades and into the future. But it involves radical action at the household level that includes people doing things without social or legal license to do it. And those talks that I've been giving have been funded by councils, and I'm telling people to break the law, basically. And a lot of the questions are about that, like, what am I allowed to do in my backyard, sort of thing. And it's felt to me that, at least in the Australian context, some of the people who are asking those questions, what am I allowed to do? And I'm saying, don't ask, just do it. Or make sure you have the social license from the neighbours, but don't worry about the legal license. They're the same sort of people who might be prepared to lay down in front of the police in a lockdown, in a radical action, at the Adani mine or in the central business district.
Incongruencies, yeah. But when you're talking about the crash on demand and the context you wrote that for, I was thinking about your latest book and the application in places like Brazil.
Yeah.
I translated a few of your things, and it already sort of causes a bit of a difficulty because suburbs in Brazil are the poor people. So it's already that sort of geographically, the name already sort of causes that confusion. In Brazil, we have the opposite, which is poor people couldn't care less about the rules because rules are made by people who apparently don't care about them. So there's a disregard for rules. But there is the other problem that we have there is that people are being alienated and indoctrinated in the individualist sort of culture to an extent that it's hard to mobilize people. They're enslaved in the workforce or just to survive even in the sort of non-formal economy in a way that gets hard for them to establish connections or pathways out of their situation. So how do you see, how could we tell that story of, say, let's create a fun challenge for both of us. How we would retell the story of hetero suburbia if we would do it in a favela in Rio or São Paulo?
Yeah. Well, that is a challenge that I have, not really addressed in there's two levels. What I've done in the Australian context is I've focused on low density residential because I believe that's a sweet point in that adaptation compared with higher density urban, because there's less stakeholders have to be involved in the translation of the physical and biological spaces compared with the greater complexity of higher density. And so it's possible to start at the household level without so much support. But of course, in an affluent society, that low density is still supported by all the infrastructure and the social services and everything that keep the wider framework ticking over while you start modifying what you're doing and connecting with a neighbour or someone down the street or whatever. Those background systems are still in place. I can see in the favelas in Brazil, a lot of those, as I would understand it, those systems of infrastructure and social support are not really there. People are more on their own. But there may be some advantages that people understand that they are on their own, that, you know, the power is unreliable, the water is unreliable, the social services are unreliable. So yeah, there's that freedom to act. How to get greater collective action may still be something which is a little bit in common with Australia, because, as you say, the ideology of the individualism, the one level of collectivity that a lot of people can relate to and probably find themselves in to some degree is the extended family. Because what we know from history is that when times get tough, and it's already happened in the United States, there's a reconsolidation of people in larger households, more people living together. So although the household, even a large, well-organised household, can't do all the functions that are needed and needs to be things that need to be organised at the community level are really important. I think to some extent there's been this, activists have often either thought, okay, there's the individual level and there's the community level, and tended to ignore that actually most people are living in some form of household that is the basic social and economic unit of society. Now, it's mostly a family, but I use the word household to sort of not really, you know, just see it in terms of, you know, a conventional family, living in a nuclear family.
Not frame the reader's mind in what a family is.
Yeah. But I think from history we can see that that reconsolidation of extended family household, you know, of older parents moving back in with adult children, or young adults, you know, having their partners join them out of sort of necessity. And we're getting this in Australia despite the affluence because of the astronomical cost of real estate now, so that you know, no one can afford to have their own place. So we're starting to see this process happening more because of that reason. And of course, if people have a bad experience of that, it's not something that's necessarily working very well. There's all sorts of issues and relationships, you know, from the past and power differentials, but navigating those differences, I think, are one way to sort of build towards community capacity. Because if you don't have strong households, I think building a community level structure on the top of that is actually very, very weak foundations, because those...
A house of cards.
Yeah. And I think that is a way of also navigating between, yes, some people in the community will be naturally, we've got to get together, we've got to organise and feel great strength and empowerment by actions they take that are collective. And that may involve, you know, organisation of basic infrastructure or security in the neighbourhood or anything that more people can see the common need for. And inevitably that will tend to be a little bit conservative in what that paradigm is. You know, the more you go out to a larger group of people, the more you have to accept some common understanding of what the underlying value structure is. So here, for example, it's things like bushfire resilience at the community level. There's people in, you know, suburban neighbourhoods that are potentially impacted by bushfire that can all see the value in those things.
We actually also
whatever
have
their
that
politics.
in Brazil, in some small towns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So finding those ways of collective action that build resilience and build community connection that don't require people to have sort of our world view.
Yeah.
That, you know, I think is finding what those things are at the same time of supporting the people to move in their households beyond a treadmill of debt and work and busyness to how can we work out how to do more for ourselves in the household and reduce our dependence on constant, you know, work away, and whether that's by adjustment of behaviour or sharing in a larger household. So the more members of the household are at least doing something to build that household economy, rather than, you know, just that running all the time.
Yeah, I guess it's part of these things that you mentioned, David, are already in the Brazilian culture. Despite the economy, like even affluent people, rich people, whatever, we always had a very strong notion of extended family. It was never that weird for a Brazilian family to have people just living, staying, or adding, you know. That wasn't the problem. The interpersonal skills as well. I have friends from the US, from Europe, and even from here in Australia, that they go there and they get amazed by how people are sort of warm, and the you know, the solidarity that is on the streets and this sort of stuff. And they say, like, I don't understand, these people struggling and they're so nice. And so, well, they're nice to each other because they're struggling.
Yeah.
There's no welfare state. They can't put the blame. They can't go to a place, or they can't refer you to another place. You know, if you come to a friend and say, I'm sick, that's it. You're sick. You need to be, you know, looked after. So largely these skills are there. And I know that the principles are, you know, universals, even like the pathways to sustainability and the retro suburbia one. But I keep sort of trying to not model, but try to understand them in that context, which is extreme poverty. We need more people to move from the sort of high density centers to where they can actually do a little bit more. I think the statistics now are something like 85 or 90% of people, you know, living in towns, not in rural areas anymore. And which brings us to another, you know, topic that we've been discussing there with a few friends. We believe in permaculture as one of the strongest transition tools, or tools to create a healthy transition. But in Brazil, there is a problem, which is it tends to be a middle class tool.
Yeah,
we're not being efficient in sort of sharing it or creating the change or allowing for youngsters to actually make the tool their own and go out there and do it their own way. I've said recently that one of the things that we need to share, you know, one of the how do you say in English? In the fair share of permaculture, one of the things that we needed to share more is the authority. We need to make people comfortable with the idea that they will be leaders, they will be teachers, they will be the next generation, which you in a recent interview you mentioned with Costa about the succession of the movement. And you also have said elsewhere that there's always this tension of go out there, you can't do it worse, and rein people in and say, look, there's all of this, and somewhere between these two, we need to allow for more people.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that issue first of the permaculture activism being primarily something of the middle class in Brazil. I was very interested when I was there of what the crossovers might have been with movements like the Landless Peoples movement and, sort of at the international level, you know, how that fits in with the food sovereignty alliance and things like that. I mean, we have sort of similar disconnects here that colleagues who are part of the Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is really, you know, global movement of peasant and small farmers. Here, that tends to be small boutique organic pioneer producers who are in fact producing produce for relatively affluent middle class consumers, because that is the only way to survive in that small farm. But, you know, there's an ideological solidarity through to movements, you know, that have existed and come out of places like Brazil. So, I mean, I think one of the ways from a movement point of view is to act as a positive agent of influence with permaculture ideas through other existing frameworks that have some lineage or heritage in working with, you know, the dispossessed. So, and whether it's the dispossessed or people, you know, at the bottom of society in different ways. So that's sort of like permaculture working to influence existing organizations in ways that are perhaps, you know, recognizing complementarities. The other is this issue of within the movement itself, how it draws in people from different lineages and classes as teachers, designers, activists, who can express the, you know, the culture and perspectives of those other groups. And you know, part of that, I think, is the valuing, how you value skills, like practical skills and ability, even physical capacity, rather than just intellectual knowledge and ability to communicate that through conventional didactic methods. So how you give status to things that don't sort of take for granted university education. Because one of the things I saw in Latin America generally, and not just in Brazil, was a very strong ideological belief about higher education and the importance of higher education, and that as a pathway, obviously, to supposedly being better off economically, which I think is largely showing up in the already affluent world to be a con trick, that people now have this huge debt and actually don't have the skills to actually create their own livelihoods, and they're dependent on being able to be employed by some corporation in some capacity. So that partly there's that thing of saying, the skills that might be undervalued are those of the practical person. And can that be used as a way of both letting people know who have those skills that they are valued, that their contribution is valued, and designing processes that take advantage of that. So in the Australian context, I've said that within the movement, it's really important with permaculture teachers that they recognise and acknowledge the practitioners in their area who are doing really great things, even if they're not teachers, communicators, designers, and that partly the role of permaculture activists, designers and teachers is to help interpret and give status to people who might be doing things not using the word permaculture, but that when we use permaculture ethics and principles to look at what people are doing, we say that is a good example.
Yeah.
We are giving status to that, no matter what the name or the lineage of how people got to do what they are doing.
Yeah. I find it interesting that you're saying this, because I was in a way inspired or challenged to give a few pointers on how to do this, because I was bothering people that are older than me in Brazil about this holding of authority. They teach a course, and the permaculture universe is so complex and so wide and deep that people get scared of start teaching. And we need people to start teaching as soon as possible, because we don't have time anymore. Yep. And one of my questions was like, does it matter if we call it permaculture? If it's been done, it doesn't matter. Because the point of permaculture, as I understood it, is like it's a tool to empower people to do things. If they're already doing it, the name doesn't matter that much. So one of the things that I said was like, well, one of the things that we could do today in a very well-connected online sort of networked environment is we need to share the surplus of authority. We need to start complimenting other people and endorsing other people and sharing their material. And we need to, and that doesn't seem much, but if I get some, if I get to, let's just say, for instance, if I get David Holmgren saying that, oh, I read an article by this guy, Brazilian guy that lives in Australia, well, that will draw like 1,000 people to read that next day. But usually, and part of that is conscious, part of that is unconscious. People hold on to the authority because that gives them the power to create the narratives that they want. And also, a lot of people in permaculture draw a lot of their livelihood from teachings. So there's just that sort of fine balance of, well, I'm teaching, but if a lot of people start teaching, then I will have less students, or,
Yeah. Look, I think that issue has certainly always been a strong one for me, to try and acknowledge other sources of inspiration and parallel value of people coming from different lineages, and see the crossover and the cross-fertilization between those. And that's been a big theme of my work within the permaculture movement, to point to things that are happening from outside it that reflect permaculture principles. Now, that runs into another sort of tricky political and power relationship, that of co-opting of, and especially in relation to Indigenous and traditional knowledge, where, permaculture is to some extent, being accused of, co-opting Indigenous knowledge. So for me, from the very beginnings of permaculture, we identified this traditional and Indigenous knowledge as a source of inspiration and a continuing source of, if not direct design solutions, then sort of more basic principles and processes. So I think the important thing is acknowledgement of source, and that people have their own lineage, but saying, okay, this represents a good expression of permaculture principles, but not accepting this idea that, therefore, only they can talk about that, only they can practice that, because in a recombinant world of novel ecosystems, of migrant cultures, the whole world is in a complete flux. So, and I think this is happening on the other side too, within Indigenous cultures, are saying, no, we can't just hold this for ourselves. We need to spread what we know. We can't take the old view that unless you are initiated into this knowledge system, you can't know and you are not allowed to use this. So that debate's going on at that other end as well. Now, of course, that's only sort of one aspect of that, but I think the more common one is parallel visions of new society or new ecology, that in a time of chaos and unraveling, there's many, many different threads to that. And that creates an ambiguity because, it's important to be able to also hold true to your own values and visions, that because you see value in what others are doing, it doesn't mean to say you necessarily endorse everything, about that, and I think the aspect of permaculture being held as a tight lineage at its sort of worst is the sort of notion of like a fixed curriculum that was sort of laid down in stone in the 1980s, and then the world doesn't change, or there's not new ideas or new possibilities. So, for example, all the understandings that are emerging about, something like biochar weren't part significantly of Mollison's designer's manual. But there's a huge, understandings that are emerging in relation to that. And so I think that having an acceptance of the fluidity of permaculture teaching, and that people will take it in different ways, and at the same time accepting that in that spread there is also the risks of dilution of original inspiration, and of co-option the other way, where permaculture becomes co-opted by forces that, you know, we don't necessarily agree with. Now, in terms of being the co-originator of the concept, I've had to accept over the years a lot of that. And, you know, some of those things relate to all sorts of practical, technical things, or lifestyle things, and things that, you know, really have big implications for future survival, whether it's, you know, the veganism, meat-eating debate that goes on in all different countries at different sorts of levels, or
where do you stand on that one?
Well, in the context, I think there's different contexts in different places.
Of course.
You know, in this country, we have 2% of the continent is considered arable land that can grow food, and most of that is degrading rapidly under food growing. And yet the country produces animals from wild grazing and pasture, whether you manage it or not. You know, kangaroos, rabbits, camels, apart from the sheep and cattle, and, you know, so my view is that, you know, that the intensive livestock industries are an ecological and ethical anathema, and we should never, you know, never do anything to support those and encourage them, you know, policies to close them down. But we also don't eat any meat from the centralised abattoir systems because we regard those as unethical. But in terms of managing this continent, managing it without animals is a recipe for it will be managed by fire. You know, but I can see at the other extreme, if you are somewhere like Bangladesh, where there's almost all the land is intensively cultivated, the privilege of having animals occupying more than a tiny part of that ecology in the form of ducks or chickens, you know, maybe pigs, is completely inappropriate ecologically and inequitable, and, you know, and it's much better to maximize the production of vegetable protein. So, you know, I think between those two extremes, you've got, you know, a lot of difference. And I was surprised or interested that when I was in Brazil, the whole notion of what the populations of wild animals are wasn't such a big sense of there being abundances or plagues of wild animals in most places. And I couldn't understand how much of that was inherent to the ecology and how much of it is because actually poor people are going out there and hunting all these wild animals. You know, and similarly, it's hard to understand here what would happen if Australians didn't have any meat production. How long would the wild animal population feed the country?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we have 60 million kangaroos in this country, you know, and we know the sustainable harvest take in a kangaroo population is about 15% per annum can be taken, and we're harvesting 1 million kangaroos a year, and, you know, the population keeps going up and up. So, in the sense of what is the surplus in the system, we here can't ignore the fact that animals are a surplus that for balance need to be sort of brought into balance at the same time that there's other animals that are, threatened with extinction. And so it's a complex thing, but in a personal sense, we eat a diet that's, a fraction of the meat consumption of what Australians do.
We diverged, but the reason why we did is because cooptation you mentioned in permaculture in Brazil, we're having a few weird cooptations. One is we have neo-conservatives people, like conservative people setting up eco villages and things like that, and supposedly using permaculture, but they can't see that permaculture is totally averse to their political views. We have neoliberals, people saying that I come from people saying some such things like I come from a right-wing sort of background, and I don't see any problem in profiteering or profiting from permaculture. All those sort of cooptations. One of them from the radicals in the more sort of environmentalist perspective is like, well, permaculture should evolve and be vegan because vegan is the most sort of advanced form of environmentalism. So all of those things from all ends, like you said, they're very complex. But one of the things that I said to this group of friends that are trying to sort of organize actions was that, well, these things are emerging like weeds emerge when you have open soil. We have a lack of endorsement. We have a lack of content production. We have a lack of people willing to tackle issues that are complex, but nonetheless they need to be approached like the vegan thing, or is permaculture socialist or not? Like in Brazil, if you say you're socialist, in some ways it's almost like like the market, let's say the marketism in the US. You have that ideology of it's sometimes if you identify yourself with that can be a very sort of negative characteristic. So people try to steer away from political views in permaculture, but in doing that, the other end comes in. So
well, I think where we can deal with that at a community level with people who have different ideologies, but we can see some common interest. We can exchange seed with people who have views of the world which are just completely anathema to us. I think that is important to maintain that level of conversation and acceptance that, there's maybe in the US context, there's people who would see themselves as right-wing libertarian, survivalists, treating permaculture as part of their toolkit. And if someone in your neighborhood is like that, or at that low level, that discussion and contact, that you have some common interest, I think is important to foster, while not confronting head on the complete differences of view, but at the higher level in the sense of, permaculture becoming branding for some corporate or large scale organization that, structures that put a permaculture branding on what they do. Not that that can be easily controlled, but I think it should be resisted and called out. So it's a difficult crossover because because those people at the bottom have some at least ideological connection or synergy with those. It's like I'm saying in the US context, and increasingly here, this polarization in society is very undermining at the bottom levels of society for communities to be able to cooperate, because the ability to sit down and come to a common view of the world is very, very problematic.
Yeah, virtually impossible. Brazil's divided now by people who believe that the right wing came in to chase corrupts, and those who see them as a fake. And like you said, it's virtually impossible to have a dialogue. And then things get very rigid.
Whereas if those people were to talk about something they have in common, they may find, something they can connect with. So we've found that in our own community here in working on informal management of the public land, the partnership in the 90s was very strong with another person who was fourth generation local here, who would just be described as a right-wing redneck libertarian. And, if I got into debates with him in 91 about the Gulf War, it was a big problem, or still talking to him about Muslims, but if we talk about trees and what's happening in nature and practical things, then there's an enormous commonality. Now, I can't say that have those relationships achieved a security that would mean that in some chaotic future, those people wouldn't stand back while, the fascist forces came in and identified me as a problem. Would they actually defend me, or would they stand at the back and let that, so those processes are that building of trust is a very slow, long process, I think, whereas trust is destroyed very easily.
Very rapidly,
but it takes a long time to, build that. So, I think, obviously, within environmentalism, I saw, the different perspectives felt a bit to me like my parents' radicalism in communism in their youth, that there were the Maoists and the Trotskyites and the Stalinists, and they're all attacking each other type of thing. And there is a little bit of that sort of aspect in environmentalism, rather than the ability to acknowledge, different contributions. So similarly, like in the United States, I've pointed out to people that a lot of the people in the survivalist sort of prepper tradition have actually thought about a lot of practical things, and at a technical level, sometimes they've thought through things quite well. At other levels, they haven't. The fact that you can't constantly be awake, manning the guns, that you depend on community, that the individual survivors just doesn't add up. But a lot of them have gone a lot further compared with, say, people at the other end of the spectrum, like in the transition movement, who are very focused on community process and collective process, might at the same time be people who haven't understood that their superannuation might not exist when, you know, that they haven't actually done enough to look after number one. They're so out there engaged that, you know, they could, in the smallest real crisis, they could fall over when they're the people we need with the values to be enabled and empowered. So that balance between looking after notions of self-interest and notions of collective and mutual support, I think is recognizing there's strengths and weaknesses in all sorts of different.
The challenge to use integrate rather than segregate all the time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
To give you feedback, David, in Brazil, my brother works to an extent with the landless movement because there's a few camps around our family farm. And one thing that it's a feeling that I have from what I saw there is that the successional agroforestry movement in Brazil is spreading way faster within the landless movement and those you know, dispossessed in the rural areas than permaculture. And basically because it attends to a basic need, which is we need to produce food now.
Yep.
And anyway, there's this few sort of contexts in Brazil which, like, people in permaculture should be integrating that knowledge from the succession agroforestry as the movement has been growing in Brazil. There is a little bit of a tension there. There's people doing agroforestry without any sort of, not all of them, but it's many of them, implementing forestry systems without any sort of analysis of zoning or even though it changes when they do that way, or sectors. And then on the other hand, we have people in permaculture saying, well, we're not going to integrate that because in permaculture, the syllabus is, you know, the food forest as Bill used to teach. So we have all these little things, but the major feedback from your comment was that in the landless movement, that sort of agroecology or succession agroforestry is spreading faster, in my view, than permaculture.
Well, I think that is an example of the sort of movement where permaculture should be aiming to work as a positive agent of influence through those processes and accept the strength of that lineage and the achievements, but also subtly trying to work within that to introduce greater design strength and, you know, what permaculture can contribute, identifying where permaculture can add value rather than saying, oh no, you know, that goes against what we say here. Where can, you know, that extra thing be, you know, contributed? I certainly, one of my criticisms of permaculture as I've seen it around the world is that there can be, partly through this emerging out of or being practiced through middle-class privilege, that people's focus on the importance of ecosystem services, of biodiversity, of all sorts of different important values, that people are so focused in that zone that actually, is this system producing basic food? You know, or are people still actually being fed from the supermarket system, but they've got this beautiful, diverse, you know, permaculture garden, because there's not that focus on, you know, is this achieving basic needs? And as well as that means you're not reducing your impact and dependence and contribution on those larger systems. You're also creating systems that more poorer people focused on immediate needs can't necessarily see value in. It's like in Mexico, our colleague Eugenio Gras, who tragically died a few months ago, he, in introducing permaculture in a lot of places in Mexico and in keyline farming, before that he was working with the people working on biofertilizers, and saying, you know, of just getting peasant farmers off the hook of constantly buying synthetic fertilizers and them being able to make stuff from their own resources and getting really high quality produce and, you know, solving pest problems. He said, if we can get that, then the longer term things of, can we get them to plant trees, and can we get them to redesign landscape, all of those things become possible. But until we've got that first stage, you know, it's harder to sort of...
And until they trust whoever the person is that came in with that specific thing that started to help them.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the building of trust again.
And he used to do things like find a person in a village who people in the village thought was an innovator and an experimenter, and he'd go and ask him for help in identifying plants in the mountains or whatever, and employ the guy to teach him what this guy knew and build a relationship like that, and then start to say, well, I could help you with your farm thing, you know, and do that as an exchange, effectively as consultancy, and then say, look, if you get an increase in produce, I want half the increase in the produce. So he was building relationships like that with innovative peasant farmers who were the, you know, the creative ones that others in the village would then look at and say, oh, you know, whereas he said, you know, if I did something, he said, I'm just regarded as a white person, you know, an affluent middle class. I mean, I didn't understand before I went to Mexico, still that distinction between, you know, the Spanish people and the, you know, it's still all there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, he went on to work with very large landholders also doing large scale keyline, you know, modification of landscapes in Mexico and you know, working at that level as well. But I think that whole area of the people who, I'm not sure how strong that is in Brazil, but those teachings about biofertilizers and stuff that's gone, my understanding, it's gone through the Landless Peoples Movement and very large numbers of effectively uncertified organic farmers in different countries in Latin America, that whole lineage, which also has a radical agroecology political perspective behind it. So there's, you know, very strong synergies there with permaculture. I didn't have a sense of how strong that connection was also, you know, with permaculture. But I think, yeah, definitely identifying where those successes are and saying, okay, how can we add value here?
So yeah, it's an awesome message, Dave. Dave, I took a lot of your time. I'm very grateful for your goodwill. I even forgot to introduce our conversation and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
Just one final question or comment that I would like you to comment on, which is, I see Brazil in a heavily sort of in a very strong brown tech context. Corporations are hijacking or have hijacked the government. All the resources are going to sort of funneling resources of all kinds to the hands of a few, this sort of stuff. And you have a very strong background in the anarchist movement or school of thinking. And this sort of came through the conversation today, but any sort of specific thoughts about how this way of positioning ourselves in relation to community, self-reliance can actually sort of more specifically add to that empowerment against this sort of brown tech scenario?
Yeah, look, I think the not having expectations about reform from the top, that recognizing that a lot of the structures are part of larger scale dysfunction rather than just evil people. I mean, I think there is, genuinely evil people maybe, but more people just driven by circumstances around them that are structural and in a lot of ways self-organizing. So that leads to two conclusions. Firstly, there's a psychological difference with dealing with those systems like they are more like the weather, like unfavorable climate, something that is real, something that you must be aware of and minimize your exposure to, but a certain acceptance that it's something that happens rather than something that is product of just some all-powerful entities going, I think we should do this because it, is just so Machiavellian and evil. Now that can be regarded as that's fatalism, that it's accepting that, whereas these are human constructed systems and therefore we can design something else. And I think we can design something else, but we need to design it in the shadow of that system rather than trying to push that system over. Because I think that system is actually falling over, but of course it's creating chaos as it does. But I think we need the radicalism of self-organization, but the Aikido or the martial art of dancing around those forces and seeing them as dinosaurs increasingly fighting each other, different parts of the elite systems fighting each other for control of the world, which I suggested in my essay, Oil versus Money, the battle for control of the world, rather than them being some hegemonic, perfectly coordinated sort of plan to destroy the world and disempower people. So accept that there's huge amounts of dysfunction there, and that will create opportunities as well as creating absolutely tragic sort of predicaments that we can't solve, but not necessarily driven by, massive evil intent. And I think that the belief in people's basic goodness, but they're working from a position of internal damage, psychological damage, and enormous constraints. And that includes people very high up that appear to be powerful, but they actually are working within a straitjacket. And as soon as they try and break out of that straitjacket, they will lose power and be placed by, you know, someone else. So I think that is a sort of a difficult balance to maintain. But I think the basic faith in people's ability to collectively organise for the common good is illustrated constantly in natural disasters and crises, that people spontaneously do, come together, and that we can see how that can then fail later on, but that innate collectivist nature, that is actually our true nature from an ecological point of view. So that connection between, you know, self-organization for collective purpose is what humans do, rather than that they go off and they just look after themselves as individuals. So that deep collective wisdom is something that's not just a political ideology, it's actually deep in our ancestry as a species that doesn't actually have much going for it as an individual animal on the planet. You know, that without fossil fuels, we're pretty fragile sort of being. So I think, you know, maintaining that faith in collective processes, which of course at the heart of anarchism, that you don't need sort of rigid structures over humans for them to actually self-organize and make functional social structures, and that we have to build that from the bottom up in parallel, while maintaining awareness of those larger forces and recognizing that there are still people in those systems who are people attempting to do what they see as good work. So some dialogue, you know, in that brown tech world, which becomes increasingly hard as the paths move further and further apart, that you're increasingly in the brown tech world having to choose whether you're in the system or you're outside of the system. And that, whereas obviously it would be better if we could build these new parallel systems with maintaining connection between people who are attempting, still maybe without much effect, trying to reform those systems, you know, so that we don't completely lose contact between that, even if it's just from an informational point of view, to be informed about actually what's better going on, rather than just regarding it as this great amorphous system. And I think that is important for those of us at the bottom, that there's huge differences at that higher level and different forces at work and people are attempting to work within those systems.
I haven't read this essay, David, but I must say I find this perspective very useful. Not seen as a systemic, overarching, hegemonic structure, but one that has its cracks. You know, has its sort of it's also fighting and falling apart as well. Yeah, it's a very useful one. David, thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind just holding there, I'll just stop here where we are. was a true lesson. And it was very nice to be able to listen to you.
Oh, well, it's good to be able to connect and also understand a little more of the situation in your context in Brazil. And I've been very aware of the difficult larger context, and even some of my old political anger rose up again as I saw, the American empire, effectively another fascist coup. But I also, know that there's many good things happening under all of that bad news.
True.